Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Off-Farm Income Podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining us here on our YouTube channel for episode number 987. Well, can you tell what I'm wearing here on YouTube? As I record this episode today, I'm wearing a sweater, pants, some layers underneath. I mean, I'm in Idaho, and here we are. It's early February, but our guest is not. He is down in Florida. And I am very excited to bring this interview to you today. I've got a podcast I want to recommend to you. Something that was actually recommended to me by my father-in-law, a podcast called Between the Beaches. And it is all about cattle ranching and the cattle ranching history of the state of Florida. Now, I don't want to give any spoilers here, but I will tell you, you are going to be surprised by some of the facts that come out and some of the history of cattle ranching in our country, in America, that has to do with Florida. It's really interesting. Well, today I'm interviewing the host and the creator of that show, Mr. Brad Phares. He's coming on, and I am very excited to introduce you to him, everything he does in the world of cattle ranching in Florida, and we're going to get that started for you right now. Brad, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Glad to be here.
Hey, I'm excited. I'm a fan. My father-in-law, he left me a voicemail maybe 3 weeks ago or something like that. He had seen an article in a magazine. I still don't know what magazine, and it was talking about your podcast, Between the Beaches, and so he suggested I listen to it, and man, I've been listening to it ever since, especially when, out feeding and stuff like that. I've got a little speaker I've got in my Ranger as I drive around and I feed, and I've got you going, and I'm listening to stories about Florida cattle ranching and learning a ton. Really learning a lot. It's been really fascinating. So thank you for putting that out.
Well, I really appreciate it. It's been a bit of a surprise to me to see just how far the reach has gone in 1 year of doing it. So pretty excited about that.
Yeah, it's very fun. Very fun to do. Mine started, I'm sure, very similar to yours. We'll get your story here in a minute, but yeah, it's great. Podcasting's great because you can find all this obscure information that you would never find in a television station or a radio station or something like that. And then, man, you can learn a ton, and it's been a lot of fun. Now, we've got you on Zoom, and I'm going to ask you about you and your background here in a minute, but man, you've got an awesome background behind you. So I'm looking over your right shoulder, and there's a picture of a gentleman in a cowboy hat. I'm assuming, because I've heard you talk about your ancestry going way, way back in Florida and southern Georgia in cattle ranching, but is that like grandfather or something like that in that photo?
That's a picture of my great-grandfather.
Your great-grandfather. Yes. Okay. And then I'm looking over here by the wall, and I see what appears to be, I can just see a glimpse of it, a nice bull elk, and I'm like, well, that's an Idaho thing, not a Florida thing. What's going on with that bull elk?
Yeah, actually, that one is, that's a New Mexico bull.
Okay.
Yeah. That was an archery bull I got. Let's see, that would have been back around 2012, I guess it was.
Oh, no kidding. Now, there's some nice elk in New Mexico, and my goodness, archery. I can't see the full thing, but from what I can see, that looks like a nice archery bull. Is that a Pope and Young bull?
Yeah, I don't think I ever stuck him in there, but yeah, he very well could have been.
Yeah, I think so. Wow, that's a nice bull.
I think he rough scored about 330, if I remember right.
Very cool, man. That's awesome. Very cool. Well, man, I'm excited. So let's do this. I'd like to have you introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us where you're at, what Between the Beaches is about, and then I've discovered Cow Hunters Unlimited by finding Between the Beaches, and so we got to talk about that as well. If you wouldn't mind, just give us a little bit of your bio.
Sure. So I am 8th generation in the cattle business, 7 here in Florida, and that's on my mom's side of the family. And of course, that whole history we can get into as we go further along, but just in general terms, deep ranching roots, all of them here in Florida, and of course went to the University of Florida, got a degree in animal science. And from there, I went to law school, decided about halfway through that it probably was not going to be the career path I wanted to follow, but I went ahead and finished it out and just decided not to practice. So from there, just kind of went back to what was important to me, which is our ranching heritage here and finding ways to utilize the skill set that I have to preserve it and educate other people about it. Because while I was in law school, I mean, I've always known that on a national scale, most people don't understand the history behind Florida and the fact that first cattle in what would be North America really came to Florida. And that was the start of ranching in America. So, that's just through Hollywood and one thing and another. Everything else always kind of gets the light shined on it. That's fine. I don't hold anything against anybody. But then I started realizing there's plenty of people right here in our own state that don't realize what we're doing with it.
Sure.
And so that's kind of what led me to eventually go ahead and start up this podcast, because I'd always worked on education through my artwork and through my writing. And then I ran a blog for a little while. And of course, as you know, technology and what's offered changes so rapidly. I decided, well, these podcasts are kind of up and coming. I think I got started listening to Jocko's podcast and Art of Manliness, a couple of those. And as I'm listening to some of that, I'm like, well, this is a technology and a different format that I could bring to the ag community. In particular, I saw some ag podcasts, but I really wasn't seeing anybody that's touching on a lot of the ranching issues. So it was a good way to share our history and heritage with people and get it out to a broader audience.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I can tell by that intro there that you and I have a lot in common. I call myself an old soul. I like older equipment. I like older looking clothing, and I love the Art of Manliness. I've corresponded with Brett McKay a few different times. I've got his book. I've bought his book for a few people, and I love that this is the way our grandfathers used to do stuff type of thing, and let's keep that heritage alive. I think it sounds like you're the same way.
For sure. And the cool thing is, our son is, well, in 3 months he'll be 21, but he's always been that way as well, even from a very young age. He's all about the older stuff. And so it's nice to see that it keeps passing along through the generations.
All right. Well, so a little bit about your career journey. So then you ended up, you finished law school? Did you do that? But
yes.
But did not pursue that. What career did you pursue?
Let's see. Time has kind of flown away here. I guess the first thing I started doing was I was doing quite a bit of real estate work, which I still have my real estate license and still work in that, and kind of try to approach things from the perspective of helping facilitate transactions with some of these larger ag properties to where we can keep some of those viable as we move ahead, instead of them constantly going the route of development, because that's really our biggest threat here in the state right now. And I'm sure it is in a lot of other places too. Yeah.
Interesting. And are you able to ranch full time, or do you rely on an off-farm income to support that?
Oh yeah, we definitely rely on off-farm income. I mean, I've got two brothers. It's a family operation. So it's my mom and my two brothers. And, at one point we were operating like most families that are generational. Over time, families grow and split and things get whittled down and divvied up amongst the different branches of the family. And we were no different. So when my mom was a girl, they were operating on about 6,000 acres. Right now, with just my mom and my two brothers, we're on about 1,800 acres.
Okay. And
because it got split between her and her two brothers.
Right. Okay. What part of Florida are you in?
We are in, the ranch is in Glades County. My mom's family grew up and was settled here in Okeechobee County, where is the kind of the final place they moved into and settled. But the ranch is just south of Okeechobee on the west side of the lake itself. And so it sits in Glades County.
Okay. And is that like the center of the peninsula? Do I have my geography correct?
Yeah, if anybody looks at a map, you're going to see that giant freshwater lake that's kind of right in the middle of the peninsula, lower third, basically. And so we're situated right there on that northwest side of the lake.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you a couple of things that have jumped out to me. Like, you can tell when you're really providing valuable information on a podcast, when other people are repeating things and going to people and saying, "Did you know this? Did you know this?" And the first thing that jumped out to me about your podcast, which exactly like you just described, I'm a fan of cattle ranching. I've read a million books. Well, a million. I'm not that great of a reader, but I've read a lot of books about cattle ranching in Texas, the King Ranch, Charles Goodnight, all this type of stuff, how that all got started, how it all worked. And then I tune into your podcast and you're talking about the first cattle in America being 1521 being brought in into southern Florida by the Spanish, and starting this in the 1500s, that's way before Texas got rolling in that respect, or anywhere else in the West where I'm at. So that in itself is fascinating. And then the other fact that you threw out that blew my mind, and you tell me if I remember this correctly, but during the Civil War, Florida cattle ranchers, they were providing beef to the Confederate Army. And I think you said during the Civil War, 1865, there were only 140,000 people total living in Florida. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've looked at that stat, but that's pretty accurate. Yes.
Can you even fathom in that state only 140,000 people?
No, because it's insane right now. We have 1,000 people a day moving in here, and we're sitting between 22 and 23 million people now.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Yeah. I can't imagine anywhere with just 140,000 people anymore. My goodness, that's unbelievable to think about. I mean, there had to be people that lived in Florida that they saw another person every 3 or 4 years, and that was it.
That's it. It was very remote. It was very sparsely settled, and during that time was when everybody was dealing with trying to figure out how to settle a state. And I think it was 1821, if my memory is correct, and when they had the Armed Occupation Act, which was more or less a way to get people into Florida to settle it without having to have a big federal expenditure of resources. They didn't want to have to put a lot of military into the state. So Armed Occupation Act basically said, hey, if you'll move in here and you'll settle this area and you'll live on it for X number of years, and it was 160 acres. So if you move in there, you'll stay armed, you'll take care of it, then it's yours. So not that different than the Oklahoma land rush, just different time period.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And there's another story you've told, and obviously I started episode 1 and I'm working my way up to catch up with you. But I like the story. I think it's about your grandmother who she got tired of having to drive, forget what it was, 10 miles or 18 miles or something like that, just to get to the mailbox. And so she had to get a petition from all the neighbors, which she didn't like to drive at all, but she had to drive to all their places. I think you said she was kind of introverted, but she had to go talk to all these folks. And in the end, the petition, I think, of all the neighbors was, I think, 10 or 11 signatures. And that actually was enough to get the mailbox moved closer to everybody. Do I remember that right?
You are dead on with the story. The only difference is it was actually my wife's grandmother.
Oh, your wife's grandmother. Okay.
Yep. But the story, you're dead on.
Yeah. It's really fun stuff to imagine. And man, all the brush popping and pushing cattle, all those miles that your ancestors did, and all the other ranchers in Florida, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's something I've always known there's cattle in Florida. I've never ever realized the scope of it or the history of it. So you're really making a great contribution, I think, to agriculture with this show. So obviously,
really appreciate that.
Yeah, obviously I'm a fan, and I'm recommending everybody who's listening to my show listens to yours as well. Okay, I want to take a step back from Between the Beaches, because that's a relatively new, I guess, outlet for you compared to Cow Hunters Unlimited. Do I have this right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Cow Hunters Unlimited was first, and more or less it was a way for me to, and this ties into just what you're talking about with the stories of really hitting the brush and all that, because Florida was so rough and remote. Everybody used to talk about we're going to cow hunt. Mm-hmm. And that would be when they would go out and spend a couple of weeks at a time just gathering up, and you'd get a little bunch at a time, 15, 20 head of cows at a time, and you kind of push them to a central area, a penning area, and you'd hold them there, and then you go and you'd ride and you gather more. And once you had pretty much that area all gathered up, then you could go ahead and work through the cattle. So everybody here historically has been referred to as Florida cow hunters. And so for me, when I was trying to figure out how to mesh all the different creative pursuits that I was doing, whether it be my cowboy poetry or the artwork or the line of specialty foods that I've got and that sort of thing, trying to figure out how to fit all that together under one brand, that finally hit me one day and said, well, it's all about promoting the history and the heritage. And so let's kind of capitalize on that nostalgia and educate people about what that name meant and where it came from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've done quite a bit of that with the cow hunters, with the history, and then also with the term cracker, which I found really interesting to learn about. I've always heard it as a pejorative, as a racial slur, basically.
Right.
And you talked about it and said, well, in Florida, it's not. In Florida, it's got a completely different meaning.
Yeah, it's a definite badge of honor for us natives that have been down here for so long. Florida cracker and cow hunter are two of the oldest names that everybody used to refer to themselves. And there's a lot of different theory on where it comes from. Some people say it's from the fact that we carry the cow whips and the crack of the whip, because that was used for a lot of different reasons. It was a signaling device for other riders when you were out in the woods. It was useful for killing snakes. You could decapitate a rattlesnake with it if you knew how to use it well. One thing and another. And then the other theory is that it comes from, which is kind of interesting to me because it ties into a lot of the research I'm doing now, that it goes back to the old, our Scottish ancestry, where a cracker over there was somebody that was kind of a jokester and prideful in what they did and that sort of thing. So they referred to him as a cracker. And so I think that probably plays into it. I think over time it's probably become a combination of the two.
Yeah, you just reminded me too. Another aspect of all this is the Scottish ancestry, which was really interesting. So if I remember right, your grandmother's ancestors came into America in the 1660s through Boston. Do I have that right?
Well, I've got part of them on my mom's side. They came in up there in the Boston area and then worked their way down the Atlantic seaboard very early, like you're saying. And then on my dad's side, they came in right there at Newcastle, Delaware. And most of your Scots and Irish, when they came into the U.S., went and followed the Appalachian Mountains down into the southern Piedmont. And there was some of them that went westward, and my dad's family ended up pushing westward, and they settled eventually out in Illinois in the corn country there.
Okay.
So that's what their background was.
Okay.
And then they got to Florida because my grandfather was hired to come build the first juice plants for canning citrus here.
Really? It's just so interesting to me. You talk about all this Scottish heritage in that region. And, like I'm familiar with a lot of Norwegian heritage in Minnesota, yes, North Dakota, northeastern Montana, a lot of German heritage down through Nebraska, in the San Joaquin Valley of California where I grew up, and how groups came over to America and found themselves kind of congregating in different regions of the country. I'd never put Southern Georgia and Florida together with Scots until I heard your show.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting when you start looking at migration and settlement patterns. And you're right, you probably wouldn't put those groups down here. But I mean, a really famous example of it is the fact that Chief Osceola, one of the Seminole tribe's greatest warriors, his father was a full-blown Scotsman. He was a Scottish fur trader.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Well, Brad, let's talk about your cowboy poetry and your artwork really quick. I mean, that's another fascinating aspect to what you're doing. When did that start for you, and how extensive is that?
All right, so the cowboy poetry, I started think the first stuff I started writing was when I was in high school, and that was kind of spun out of a little bit of inspiration and a little bit of boredom.
Okay.
I had been reading and come to know a lot of Baxter Black, Waddy Mitchell, and all those different guys that everybody pretty well knows, and been reading a lot of that stuff. And I thought, well, if they can write that stuff out there, I can write something about down here. And I was bored sitting on a tractor, disking up some ground so that we could plant some improved varieties of grass. And when you're sitting there jockeying that tractor all day, things get pretty boring. So I started writing while I was riding the tractor, and it just kept going from there. And the painting probably was earlier, because from the time I was old enough to hold a pencil or crayon or whatever, I was always doodling and drawing. It was something that my mom recognized, and she tried to work me into some classes, and never really kind of worked out until I was somewhere around 10 years old. She found a place that was doing art lessons, but it was this real abstract, I shouldn't say real abstract. It was just a different painting style, more of like along the lines of what you see Bob Ross doing, where you knock it out one sitting. And so I did a little bit of that, but it really wasn't exciting me, because I guess even then I kind of knew I was more into photorealism sort of thing. So I didn't do anything again with the artwork until I was in college, and ended up meeting a guy who served as a mentor to me. He had worked under Beanie Backus, who's a real famous Florida landscape artist. And the guy that I met, his name's Rick Kelly, and he was a landscape artist. So he wouldn't take money for lessons, but it was one of these things where he said, whenever you're home from university, just come over here, sit down, pick my brain, we'll paint side by side. And so I just learned by doing with him. And I kind of taught myself how to do people and animals just by looking at other artists' work, because nobody else I knew of down here was doing it. But of course, with a ranch background, I knew it was something that I wanted to try to accomplish.
Yeah, it's fascinating how involved you are in all these different aspects. You brought up Baxter Black. He was maybe the 5th or 6th guest I ever had on my podcast on this one, on Off Farm Income, way back in 2015. And when I started this deal, I had an imposter syndrome. Like, sitting down to record my voice, I would get embarrassed. I'd be the only one in the room, and I would get embarrassed because I was like, how arrogant am I that I think I can record my voice and somebody's going to want to listen to it. And the first time I really understood the power of inviting somebody to do an interview versus just saying, hey, can I talk to you and ask you about your career and pick your brain, was when I reached out to Baxter Black and said, and talked to his publicist and said, hey, I'm doing an agricultural podcast. I'm just getting started. I'd love to interview him, have him on the show. And they said yes. And I'm like, well, this opened a door, didn't it? And so it's funny we've got that in common. That's interesting.
You're right. It's very strange the first time you sit down and start recording your voice and start dropping your ideas out there, because you're right. You take a step back and you're like, why is anybody going to listen to me?
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. It's been great. Have you ever come out to Elko? That's not too far from where I'm at, and done any of your cowboy poetry at the festival there?
I have not. I've not been on stage with it. I was actually out there with the artwork more than anything.
Oh.
I'm trying to remember the year now. 2010, 2012, somewhere right in there. They featured Florida and Louisiana. And so we went out there. We have a Cowboy Artists Association of Florida. So the group of us went out there to kind of supplement the show that Florida was doing.
Okay. And now I'm just getting started into your podcast, meaning I'm going sequentially starting at episode 1. And so far I'm hearing a lot of cowboy poetry. Is that something you're putting in every episode now?
It's not in every one. I've kind of tried to strike a balance between having one that's a little more relaxed and just pure entertainment, where it's the poetry and people can kind of just chill out and go somewhere else other than where they're at.
Yeah.
At least in their mind. And then I do the others that we get into either covering historical events, or we may be dealing with some of the more heady issues of the day that we're all facing and trying to advocate for. So I try to just flip flop back and forth between them.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you about your guys' cattle down there. Is all your cattle have air in it, or can you run like straight European breeds there in Florida?
As you get further up the peninsula and more North Florida and Panhandle region, you'll see a lot more of the English and continental breeds and that sort of thing. Down in this end of the state, you definitely have to have ear on the cattle because of the fact that it just gets so dang humid and sticky in the summer, and the bugs and all the other stuff that goes along with that.
You know, it's funny. Every time I've ever been to somewhere tropical, whether it be Florida, I've been to Florida one time, but we drove through a little bit of the state, and or being down like in southern Texas, or even in Hawaii. Whenever I see grass like that, you know, everybody I'm with is looking around. If it's Hawaii, they're looking at the beach. If it's Florida, they're looking at the beach or whatever. I'm looking at the grass, and I'm like, man, what would it be like to graze cattle here? But then when it comes to Florida and southern Texas too, I can never stop thinking about the snakes. Is that I just imagine if you're out in these prairies working cattle all the time, you've got to be bumping up against snakes all the time. Am I just fantasizing about this?
Yeah, honestly, it's not as often as you might think it would be. They're certainly there, but I think they move out of the way before you get there most of the time.
Okay.
Not that we don't stumble up on rattlesnakes. We got your diamondback, and then we've also got the pygmy rattlesnake. You've got coral snakes, and then of course water moccasins, which they just tend to have a little bit more of a nastier attitude than any of the rest of them for whatever reason.
Yeah, water moccasin's the only snake that's ever chased me down in Texas, and they were on the creek, and you walk up to the edge of the creek, they start coming towards you. And I was not a fan of that. I did not like that.
No, and it's my dad tells, well, he passed away now, but he used to tell a story about when he was a kid fishing and he was waiting. And I'm sorry, that's different. He was in the boat in this instance. Moccasin came after the fish and somehow ended up getting in the boat. So he jumped out. It came out of the boat after him. He jumped back in the boat, and they had this whole thing going for a while before he finally was able to smack it enough with the pole that he could get it out of his way.
I'll tell you what, I'd be ranching cattle in Alaska the very next day. My goodness. Wow. That is something. All right. So, Florida and Between the Beaches podcast. I had it before I started Off Farm Income. I had like this epiphany where I said, I'm going to start a podcast. I'm going to talk about that. I know that you kind of experienced the same thing. What are the issues that ranchers are facing in Florida that made you want to speak out about it and start this show?
Yeah, it's the issues are many. As I said earlier, the biggest one is the development pressure and the fact that we're losing our wild places here in the state. And I don't think people truly understand what ranches are providing that benefits every citizen in the state in the form of open green space, water sequestration and filtration, and wildlife habitat and that sort of thing. I think it just goes completely over their head because so many have the misconception that they're picturing something more akin to a feedlot when they think of a ranch.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there's anything wrong with a feedlot, but it's just a different thing entirely. Right. And that's what the majority of urban people are thinking of when they think of a ranch. At least that's been our experience in talking to a lot of these people. And particularly with heads of these different government agencies that we have to deal with so often now, we've been doing a really big push through the Florida Cattlemen's Association and even our local county associations to get these people out on a ranch and let them see what's going on so they understand it better. Because let's face it, by nature, ag people in general, and particularly cattlemen, are very independent minded, and they're very reserved, and they don't make a big deal about what they're doing. They just put their head down and go to work.
Mm-hmm.
So we've not done over the prior years a great job of marketing ourselves and communicating to the general public about all the good things that we're doing. And fortunately, we've all kind of realized that it's a bigger task ahead of us, and we really need to get on the ball with it. So that's what's got us out and got us going and looking for new ways to accomplish that communication.
All right, so let me ask you about a few of these issues. I'll start with the green space. So when you're talking about green space that ranches are providing, and that being a benefit to everybody in Florida, describe the benefit to everybody in Florida, those 1,000 people that are moving in a day. How do these open spaces provided by ranches benefit them?
Well, the biggest thing is you're getting some carbon sequestration there. You're also having that wildlife habitat that's there, and you get all these people that come into the state, and what they're really looking for, if somebody doesn't keep some of this space open and keep cattle on the landscape and utilize grazing as a tool for management of the landscape, then and we've already seen what happens when you don't have cattle on the landscape managing it that way. There's areas that the state has bought and purchased, and then they have no management plan whatsoever for it. They have no budget to factor into that. And so then you drive back by there later, and it's filled with nothing but invasive and aquatic vegetation, woody growth that has overtaken everything, that you'd be doing well to get a dog to run through there. So that's just some of the ways that we see ranches as being important for everybody here in the state. Everybody wants to come here for the Florida that they see and know now, but yet by coming here as heavily as they are, if somebody doesn't preserve some of this space, then it's all going to be gone and be nothing but asphalt, and they'll be right back to what they moved away from.
Yeah, what they took off from. Yeah, that's really interesting. You had mentioned in one of your shows about, well, the difference between grazing and browsing. So cattle are actually complementing the deer, which people, they want to help and they want to preserve. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so obviously the species vary, but they have this kind of symbiotic relationship where you got the white-tailed deer, which is the only one we have down here. They're out there and they're browsers. So they're picking at what's up at kind of eye level most of the time and dealing more with some of that underbrush and that sort of thing. Whereas the cattle are grazing on grass down lower. So you're dealing with two different species working together to keep that landscape in a more pristine condition than if it was just let go.
Yeah, they're completely complementing each other. Now, water filtration, I heard you talk about that as well, and it made me laugh a little bit, just the differences in regions, because I'm in Idaho, where we've got tons of relief. I mean, we've got one area that's at 9,000 feet going down to our lowest part of the state, which is like, I forget, 1,800 feet, or maybe actually lower than that. I think Lewiston, Idaho is like 900 feet or something like that. And I heard you talking about one area compared to another where water's coming down from, and I think the relief was like 15 feet or something like that, if I remember right. It just made me chuckle comparing the two places.
Yes. But I was kind of sitting here laughing with you talking about your elevation there, because our ranch right there on the edge of Lake Okeechobee, we're sitting at a 15-foot elevation.
Okay.
And the headwaters for the Everglades, and most people don't realize this either, they picture the Everglades and they think south of Lake Okeechobee. The actual headwaters for the Everglades begin up there at the doorstep to Disney World, at what's called Shingle Creek, which is that I-4 corridor, that Metro Orlando area is one of the most densely populated areas in the state, and probably ranks fairly high when you compare it amongst other states. There's just a ton of people piled in there. And so what used to be just open prairie land or woods with scattered cypress hammocks and different little sloughs and flag ponds that would hold that water and let it sit there and slowly work back into the soil or slowly filter itself over to the Kissimmee River. and work its way south to Lake Okeechobee and then on to the Everglades that most people know about. That's all gone because it's all asphalt, it's all concrete, it's wall to wall. So now we've lost so much of that filtration that naturally used to be there. And so that's up there at 60-foot elevation, and it all runs downhill going to the bottom of the state.
And so the loss of filtration, the ultimate impact of that is what? There's stuff in the water down in the Everglades that didn't used to be there?
Basically, we just have very nutrient-rich water these days because the phosphorus and the nitrogen is dissolved in the water, and it's not having a chance to bind itself up as it seeps into the soil by the natural filtration process. Because of the fact, and this is, we could be here for a while on this. I'm going to try to summarize as best I can because it's a very complex issue. More or less 80 years ago, roughly, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came in, and the Kissimmee River used to be a very winding river full of oxbows, and it slowly let the water come to the south, and it filtered as it came down because it was so slow. U.S. Army Corps 80 years ago, and not bashing them because they did what the state wanted done. It was all about trying to get drainage and get more people in here and have more economic growth and so forth and so on. So they dredged it 35 foot deep, and they dredged it straight. So now you have more or less the equivalent of a super highway of water rushing from 60 foot down to 15 foot. What used to take 30 days for a drop of water to get from that Orlando area down here to the lake now happens in probably 3 days. So you're just rushing all those nutrients straight down here. And to further complicate it, the reason the river was winding was because water follows the path of least resistance. So it's going around the phosphate beds. It's going around those naturally occurring phosphate beds. So when they dredged it, they cut right through the middle of the phosphate beds and exposed them to all that water rushing through there. So over the years, agriculture in general, across many different industries, has taken a bad rap for all the nutrient issues. And it's a much more complex issue. I'm not saying that we don't play a hand in it. If you live here in Florida, you have some hand in our water quality issues, one way or another. But there's bigger things out there that the majority of people don't fully understand.
Very interesting. Well, there always is, right? And
that's it.
If you don't dig in, if you just go on the surface level of what somebody says or you see on social media or the news, you're not even getting half the story most of the time.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, interesting. I want to talk a little bit more about cattle ranching. So, here where I'm at in Idaho, I'm feeding cattle hay at least 180 days out of the year. In Florida, are you feeding at all, or do you manage your pasture so they're always grazing?
We're able to manage ours to where they're always grazing. There are others in the area that do feed more hay. If we have a really harsh winter, we'll have to feed some hay. And it all depends on whether the rainfall is continued and when it falls off for the dry season and how much moisture is left in the ground. And I know this will surprise you, but we actually do hit times where we drop down into the 20s. It's not very often, but it does happen. We've actually hit upper teens. Usually that's like a one-night spike. And then we're back up. So you do hit periods where you'll have a really harsh winter and have to feed more hay, but by and large, the majority of the time, we are not feeding hay ourselves at our place. Others may do so, and particularly if they're growing a lot of heifers out or something like that.
Okay. I've always wondered about that. So if that's your normal year to year, but you get into a situation where you do have to feed, then how do you come up with the hay? Do you put some up every year just in case, or what do you do?
Yeah, we do put up some hay, and our deal so that we don't have to, we used to have a lot of equipment for cutting hay. Over time, we've kind of whittled it away, and instead of having to deal with that, we just have somebody come in, contract cut it, and do it on halves where they take half and we keep half. And then out of that, we can sell some more if we want to, but we
Okay.
always hold some back in case we need it.
And that was going to be my next question. So if you put up enough, just, as that insurance blanket, but then you wind up not using it, can you sell it? Or is it you got to spread it out somewhere and put it back into the soil?
No, we can still sell it. In particular, a lot of times if you've got some of that leftover hay, and even if it's not as the quality has degraded some, you can still sell it to these dairies because most of them can use it as filler. They don't need high quality, they just need filler.
Oh, interesting. Well, that's interesting. All the dairy industry I'm used to out here in Idaho and then where I grew up in California, man, they take the highest of the high quality hay. So when you're talking about that, using it for filler, what are you talking about specifically there?
Well, see, most of them are feeding here in Florida. Most of them are feeding, and let me qualify this by saying I am not a dairy expert by any stretch. I got a bunch of friends that are in the business, and I probably don't know it as well as I should, but I know enough to say that they are here in Florida usually feeding a concentrated ration. They're also doing some green chop of their own and that sort of thing. So they're getting that high quality stuff, but on top of that, they still need more just as kind of a filler because, and this, you've kind of hinted at it a little bit already. Here's a big difference between the grass here and out there. Out there, you guys have a lot higher quality. You don't have as much quantity, but you got a lot higher quality because down here, we have so much water and so much rainfall that the nutrients leach out at a much higher rate. So when you come down here and you see cows, they got these big old bellies on them because they're just packing in as much forage as they can to get the same amount of nutrient that cows out there get in a much smaller quantity.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, one last question on ranching down there. Well, I got two more, but living out here in the West, wildfire is an annual thing that we deal with. And I probably don't pay close enough attention, but I'm always caught off guard when I see that you're having wildfires in Florida. But that's a real thing, right? Is that something that you face on your ranch?
We haven't had a big problem with it because we are being on the edge of that lake. We're on kind of an open prairie there. We really don't have, other than a lot of invasive trees that we're working right now through NRCS, through the equip program on a cost share, we're working on getting those out of there. But all in all, it's pretty much just open prairie with the scattered sable palms, which we call locally cabbage trees. But we don't have a lot of heavy, dense forest in our area. But other areas that are more native woods and native pasture, your pine flatwoods with the palmetto understory, you get that can be a big problem there. But most everybody does a lot of prescribed burning to try to minimize the risk of all that.
Okay. Yeah, that's just an interesting tidbit for me being in the West, but knowing that's actually a problem that comes up occasionally in your region of the country.
Yeah.
All right. This last question, it's a selfish question. So I love winter. I love the snow. I love all that. But I moved up to these climates when I was 19 years old and got out of the Central Valley of California where it never snowed and we didn't have much dynamic weather. Now, as time has gone on, I start to, every now and then, winter gets a little bit longer every year for me. My wife, she loves warm weather. She's got poor circulation. And I've said, man, we can move this farming operation to Florida. Particularly after hearing your show, I'm like, we got to look into Florida. But I wanted to ask you about that. Is that even possible anymore? Like, if you don't have the land already, if you wanted to come and buy ag land in Florida and actually find a place where that ag land could make money for you, doing something like cattle, which is what I would want to do, not some sort of a permanent crop like oranges or something like that. Is that possible, or is there just too many people moving in, driving the prices of that land?
I will not say it's impossible, but I will say it's one heck of a mountain to climb.
Okay.
Even back when I was at the University of Florida, cow-calf class there, the professor told a lot of the guys coming in, said, look, if you're wanting to get in the cattle business, there's two ways you do it. You either better marry into it or hope it's already been passed down to you through the family because you're not going to go buy into it. That's a bit of an overgeneralization, and that's why I won't completely say you can't do it, because there are some opportunities. They're just few and far between. And I would say the other key is being able to be well diversified in your operation, where you've got multiple streams of income. For somebody to come out right now and just buy ranch land here and think they're just going to run cows and pay for it, it'll never happen.
Well, it's interesting. When I went through college and we would have to do enterprise budgets and things like that, we always worked the land cost into that enterprise budget. I think anymore, most places, you pull that land cost out of the enterprise budget and you have two businesses. One, you're a land speculator. The other one, you're a rancher. It sounds like if you're trying to do it in Florida, you're kind of in the same boat.
That's it. Exactly.
Well, Brad, this has been really cool. I've loved the podcast, obviously, since I'm pulling out more facts than I even knew I remembered from things you've talked about. What are your plans for year number 2?
Trying to get a little further away from home and get to all the people further up the peninsula I know I need to get to. I had good intentions to get to them last year, and just trying to get settled into it was enough. So I decided to focus a little bit more on people that were closer around me, that I knew were kind of basically cherry picking. So there's a wealth of the same sort of history and everything further up the peninsula. And matter of fact, some really interesting guys, old timers, and they're going to be the challenge because they definitely don't have the tech and know how to use it all. So that's probably been my biggest challenge, is figuring out how to deal with those guys, because that's the guys I got to target.
Right.
They're the ones with all the great stories, but they're the least able to do something like you and I are doing now. So I've kind of got to go to them and sit down and break out all the equipment and just find a good quiet place to set up with them, knowing I'm probably not going to have the greatest audio quality if I would set up in my normal space. But it is what it is. So we're going to get them however we can get them.
Have you received any feedback? Are you making an impact so far with the podcast, or people maybe from the Florida state government, people from the Cattlemen's Association, something like that, getting back to you and going, hey, I'm noticing that they're hearing this information, it's making a difference?
Yeah, I've actually been very amazed. I mean, I knew, obviously, we're talking about the internet. It can go wherever it wants to go globally. I've been really excited at the feedback I've gotten from just people. I mean, it comes through Facebook Messenger, which I really don't use. So unless I'm on my computer, I don't see that stuff on this laptop. I don't have the app on my phone, but I get a lot of messages there. I get a ton of emails. Just go to the cattlemen's meetings and somebody will walk up and say, hey man, I've really been listening to that and enjoy the heck out of it. And it made me think of this. And so then I get leads to work off of. Another one that I just saw this morning, perfect example. This guy that I know here, his family actually didn't grow up in the cattle business. They have, I think it's 2 saltwater fishing shops over on the Treasure Coast. But they've always hunted and fished, and they appreciate it. So they bought a place more for recreation than anything, but now they've gotten into the cows. And anyhow, he's telling me this morning, because I work with him on doing I manage the gators on the property for him through doing these private land gator hunts. And he was telling me, he said, look, I don't remember exactly how he worded it. The point was, where I had Adam Bass with Conservation Florida on an episode, and they're working at doing these conservation easements. This guy had listened to that, and from it contacted Adam, and now they're looking at doing a conservation easement on his property. So there's awesome. A piece that won't end up going into development. That made my morning, because then I know I'm doing something right and I'm reaching people.
That is great, man. That's great. Good. I'm happy for you. I did not realize you were doing anything with alligators and alligator hunting. I would have asked you about that. I should have gone deeper into your website. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I didn't even think about it. It's just kind of a little side hustle, I guess. that spun out of me getting private land tags for our ranch just to manage the population there. That's a problem when you're working, and we use dogs, obviously, to work the cattle, and you're constantly dealing with losing one here and there. And so anyhow, we try to manage them. You'll never get rid of the gators. And the biologist will tell you that right up front when he shows up. He's like, if you kill a 10-footer in this spot, you're going to come back in a couple of months and there'll be another 10-footer there because that's what that habitat supports.
Mm.
And so it's more of a management thing than an eradication deal.
Mm-hmm.
And so in starting it there at my property, I ended up running into other friends with ranches. They're like, you know what? We don't want to deal with all that paperwork and headache and turning in all these reports at the end of the year. And if you want to do it, that's fine. So I started doing more of that. And originally I was just selling straight to a processor, for meat and hide. Mm-hmm. And then that market kind of went by the wayside because more of these guys started farming them versus buying them out of the wild, because your high-end Italian leather companies don't want the scratches that come with a native.
Okay.
So they're growing them in these controlled environments to avoid all the blemishes. So when that started going away, I got into partnering up with a couple of outfitters because I don't want to run an outfitting business, but I had more tags than what I could use otherwise. So they provide the hunters, I provide the tag, and it works out pretty well.
Fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Them to check out Cow Hunters as well and see all your artwork and your cowboy poetry. How can people find you? How can they listen to you?
Yeah, so the easiest one you've hinted at is the cowhuntersunlimited.com for the website there. And of course, I'm on social media with Facebook and Instagram. I've got a Twitter account, but I really don't do a whole lot with that. But yeah, Instagram, I'm pretty active there. I've gotten to where that's probably my favorite.
Okay.
So yeah, I'd be happy to have everybody check it out. And of course, we'll be talking again. I'll probably work you into the show down here with me at some point if you don't mind doing that.
Well, I wouldn't mind at all. I'd love to be embarrassed with how little I know about Florida ranching. No,
you're soaking it up. With your memory retention is very good.
It's just because I'm enjoying the show so much. Okay, so for people to find you, Cow Hunters Unlimited, and the podcast though is called Between the Beaches, which is a great title. You explained that in your first episode. And I listen to it mostly on Spotify. I'm assuming it's on iTunes and Apple Podcasts, Google Play, all those places.
Correct.
Awesome.
Yeah, and you just reminded me, I've got to update my website because I always put the links on there too, where people can play it through the website, especially dealing with a lot of the older generation that's not necessarily so current on podcasts and how to access them through an app. So if you've got just a website where I don't host them on my website, obviously, because it'll crash it, but they can at least stream it through there if they want to do it there.
Yeah, my father-in-law, when he called me and left me the message, by the way, you're noticing he didn't text me or send me an email. He called me, left me a voicemail, and said, there's this guy in Florida. He's making a website like you make. So, yeah, the older generation, sometimes we got to help them with the tech. But I send him CDs so he can listen to interviews. Like I'll send him an actual CD of this interview so he can listen to this interview with you. So we do what we can. Well, Brad, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Matt.
Well, thank you very much for being here, everybody. And thank you to Brad Phares for coming on the Off Farm Income Podcast today and sharing, man, that great story. Hey, we would love to have you as a subscriber on this very YouTube channel. Please hit that subscribe button and become one of those subscribers. And we'd love to connect with you on all our other social media platforms as well. You can find us on Instagram, on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We hope to see you there. And until next time, enjoy your journey to the ultimate lifestyle business, agriculture.